Jake Mercer's hands shook as he bid his last $50 on a horse everyone said should be shot. 6 months later, that horse would save more lives than any doctor in 3 counties. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The laughter started the moment Jake Mercer raised his hand at the auction. It rippled through the crowd like wind through prairie grass, growing louder with each passing second until it filled the dusty livestock yard with a sound that was equal parts amusement and cruelty. The auctioneer's gavel hung suspended in midair, his weathered face creasing with confusion as he looked from Jake to the pathetic creature standing in the center ring, then back to Jake again, as if waiting for the joke to reveal itself. The albino stallion stood on 3 legs, his 4th hoof hovering just above the ground in a posture that spoke of chronic pain and long suffering. His coat, which should have been the pristine white of fresh snow, was dulled by months of neglect, streaked with mud and matted in places where burrs had tangled themselves into his mane and tail. One ear hung at an odd angle, the result of some past injury that had healed incorrectly, and his ribs showed through his sides like the bars of a cage. But it was his eyes that held Jake's attention, those pale pink eyes that most folks found unsettling, even freakish. To Jake, they held something else entirely, a spark of intelligence and spirit that hadn't been extinguished despite everything this horse had endured. Jake Mercer knew what it felt like to be counted out, to be judged worthless by people who should have known better. At 53, he had exactly $217 to his name, the last remnants of a lifetime spent working other men's ranches, breaking other men's horses, building other men's dreams, while his own remained as distant and unreachable as the mountains that rose beyond the valley. His truck was held together with rust and prayer. His boots had been resold so many times the cobbler had started making jokes about it, and the small patch of land he'd finally managed to scrape together enough money to buy sat empty, waiting for the livestock he couldn't afford to purchase. The auction had been a last desperate hope, a chance to find something, anything, that might fall within his meager budget. He'd watched horse after horse sell for prices that made his stomach clench with the impossibility of it all. Prime quarter horses went for thousands. Even the decent working stock commanded more than he could dream of spending. He'd been about to leave to walk away from yet another failed attempt at building something of his own, when they'd led the albino stallion into the ring. The crowd's reaction had been immediate and visceral. Men turned away in disgust, women covered their mouths in pity, and the serious buyers simply ignored the animal entirely, already calculating the cost of disposal versus the value of whatever meat might be salvaged from his frame. The auctioneer had started the bidding at $50, more out of obligation than any real hope of a sale. The silence that followed was heavy with judgment, the kind of silence that said everyone present agreed this horse wasn't worth the feed it would take to fatten him up for the slaughterhouse. But Jake saw something different. He saw the way the stallion held his head despite the pain, the dignity that remained in his bearing, even as his body failed him. He saw intelligence in those strange pink eyes, a watchfulness that suggested this horse was taking the measure of every person in the yard just as thoroughly as they were dismissing him. Most of all, Jake saw himself, broken down and counted out by a world that valued only immediate utility and overlooked the potential that lived in damaged things. $50, Jake called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. The laughter started then, building from scattered chuckles to full-throated mockery. Someone shouted that he'd be better off burning his money, at least that way he'd get some heat out of it. Another voice suggested he check himself into the hospital because clearly something was wrong with his head. Even Pete Wilson, who'd worked alongside Jake for 15 years at the Double B Ranch, shook his head slowly, the gesture speaking louder than words ever could about what he thought of this decision. The auctioneer recovered his composure and brought the gavel down with a sharp crack that silenced the laughter temporarily. "Sold to Jake Mercer for $50, he announced, his tone suggesting he was documenting a moment of profound foolishness for posterity. "Come settle up and collect your purchase." As Jake made his way through the crowd to the payment window, he felt the weight of every pitying glance, every smirk, every shake of the head. He heard the whispers that followed in his wake about how desperation made men stupid, about how some people never learned, about how this was exactly why Jake Mercer would never amount to anything more than a hired hand with delusions of grandeur. Clara Bennett, who ran the feed store in town, stopped him on his way to collect the horse. "Jake, honey," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of concern that was really just condescension wearing a gentle mask. "You know, I think the world of you, but that horse is lame. He can't work, can't breed, can't do much of anything except eat feed you can't afford. What exactly do you plan to do with him?" The question hung in the air between them, legitimate and cutting in equal measure. Jake met her eyes steadily, his weathered hands hanging loose at his sides, work roughened and scarred from decades of hard labor. "I plan to give him a chance," he said quietly. "Same chance I wish somebody had given me when I was counted out." The simplicity of the statement seemed to take her aback, and for a moment something flickered across her face that might have been understanding or might have been deeper pity. Loading the albino stallion into his battered trailer proved more challenging than Jake had anticipated. The horse moved with extreme caution, testing each step before committing his weight, clearly protecting that damaged leg. The loading ramp, weathered and worn like everything else Jake owned, creaked ominously under the stallion's weight. Several men who'd been watching the spectacle with amused interest called out helpful suggestions, most of which involved putting the animal down and saving everyone the trouble. Jake ignored them, focusing instead on the horse, speaking in low, steady tones that had gentled countless animals over his decades of work. The stallion's pink eyes watched him with an intensity that felt almost human in its assessment. This was a creature that had learned to be wary, that had every reason to distrust the hands of men. Jake understood that wariness bone deep. He'd felt it himself often enough, that careful evaluation of whether someone's words matched their intentions, whether kindness offered was genuine or just another setup for disappointment. He moved slowly, giving the horse time to understand he meant no harm, that this was a partnership being offered, not a domination being enforced. It took nearly 40 minutes to get the stallion loaded, 40 minutes during which the crowd gradually dispersed, their entertainment value exhausted. By the time Jake closed the trailer gate and secured the latch, only a handful of stragglers remained, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. Pete Wilson approached as Jake was doing a final check of the trailer connections, his weathered face creased with concern that seemed more genuine than most of what Jake had encountered that day. "Jake," Pete began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with how to continue. "Look, I know you're set on this, but that horse, he's got problems that go way beyond what you can see. Word is he was owned by the Blackwell Ranch before they went under. They had him slated for breeding before they discovered he's got a congenital leg defect. That's not something that heals, Jake. That's something he was born with and something he'll die with." The information settled heavy in Jake's stomach. He'd assumed the lameness was from injury, something that might improve with rest and proper care. A congenital defect changed the equation entirely. It meant the stallion would never be sound, never be able to work the way a ranch horse needed to work. It meant that everyone who'd laughed at his purchase had been right, at least from a practical standpoint. But Jake had stopped making purely practical decisions years ago, right around the time he'd realized that practical decisions had left him alone, broke, and watching his dreams shrink year by year until they were barely visible on the horizon. "Appreciate you telling me, Pete," Jake said quietly, his hand resting on the trailer where he could feel the slight vibration of the horse shifting his weight inside. "But I've already made my choice. I'll figure out the rest as I go." Pete shook his head slowly, the gesture tired rather than judgmental. "You always were stubborn as a mule, Jake. I just hope this doesn't break you, doesn't. It's one thing to be broke in the wallet. It's another thing entirely to be broke in the spirit." With that, Pete walked away, leaving Jake alone with his purchase and the growing realization of what he'd committed himself to. The drive back to his property took Jake through the heart of town, past the feed store where Clara would no doubt be spreading the story of his foolishness, past the diner where the ranchers gathered for coffee and gossip, past the bank that held the note on his land and probably would for the rest of his natural life. Every familiar building felt like a witness to his poor judgment. Every person he passed seemed to carry knowledge of his latest failure. He kept his eyes forward and his thoughts on the creature in the trailer behind him, the one that trusted him enough to endure the journey despite having every reason not to trust anyone. His land, when he finally reached it, looked especially stark in the late afternoon light. 40 acres of scrub brush and prairie grass, a small barn that leaned slightly to the east, a corral that needed mending, and a house trailer that had seen better days approximately 30 years ago. It wasn't much, but it was his, the first thing he'd ever owned outright besides his truck and his saddle. He'd saved for 15 years to buy it, living cheap and working every extra hour he could find, watching other men build their empires while he scraped together enough for this small patch of hardscrabble land that nobody else had wanted. He'd named it Second Chance Ranch, a name that had seemed hopeful when he'd first moved in, but now felt more like a prayer than a promise. The sign he'd made, hand-painted letters on a piece of salvaged wood, hung crookedly from the gatepost. He straightened it as he drove past, a small gesture of defiance against the entropy that seemed to be winning more battles than he was these days. Unloading the stallion went more smoothly than loading him had. The horse seemed to sense that this place was different, that whatever was waiting here wasn't going to hurt him. He limped down the ramp with painful dignity and stood in the center of the corral, his pale coat catching the last rays of sunlight and making him look almost ethereal, like something conjured from dreams rather than purchased for $50 at a desperate auction. Jake filled the water trough from the well and spread fresh hay in the corner of the corral, where the shelter offered some protection from the wind. The stallion watched these preparations with those unsettling pink eyes, and Jake found himself talking to the horse the way he'd talk to another person, explaining his plans and his hopes and his fears. "Maybe it's crazy talking to a horse that probably thinks I'm as much a fool as everyone else does," Jake said, leaning against the corral fence as the stallion approached the water with cautious steps. "But I figure we're in this together now, you and me. Two broken down things that everybody's written off." The stallion drank deeply, his damaged leg cocked at an angle that must have provided some relief from the constant pain. When he finished, he turned his head toward Jake, and for a moment their eyes met across the dusty corral. In that gaze, Jake saw something that made his chest tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. The acknowledgement that passed between two creatures who knew what it meant to be judged and found wanting. The first week with the albino stallion tested Jake's resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. The horse, which he'd taken to calling Ghost for the pale transparency of his coat in morning light, refused to eat for the first 2 days. He would drink water readily enough, but the hay Jake provided remained untouched, and the grain he'd splurged on sat ignored in the feed bucket. Jake watched with growing concern as the already thin animal seemed to withdraw further into himself, standing motionless for hours in the corner of the corral, his damaged leg trembling with the effort of supporting even his diminished weight. On the third morning, Jake found Ghost lying down, his breathing shallow and his eyes half closed. Panic seized Jake's chest with iron fingers as he climbed into the corral and approached carefully. He'd seen this before, horses that had simply given up, that had decided the struggle of living was more painful than the release of death. He knelt in the dirt beside the stallion, his weathered hand coming to rest on Ghost's neck, feeling the rapid flutter of pulse beneath the dull coat. "Don't you dare quit on me now," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't known he was capable of feeling for an animal he'd owned for less than a week. "We made a deal, you and me. We're supposed to be giving each other a second chance. You don't get to give up before we've even started." Ghost's pink eye rolled toward him, and Jake saw something in that gaze that looked almost like apology, as if the horse understood he was breaking an unspoken contract, but lacked the strength to honor it. Jake spent that entire day in the corral, refusing to leave Ghost's side. He brought water in a bucket and coaxed the horse to drink, supporting his head when the effort seemed too much. He talked continuously, his voice a steady stream of stories and observations and promises. He told Ghost about growing up poor in Texas, about the first horse he'd ever gentled, about the dreams he'd carried for 53 years and never quite managed to realize. He spoke of loneliness and disappointment, of the weight of being told you weren't good enough so many times you started to believe it yourself. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, something shifted. Ghost lifted his head without assistance and turned toward the hay Jake had spread nearby. He took a small mouthful, chewed slowly, and swallowed, then another. The simple act of eating felt like a victory so profound that Jake felt tears prick at his eyes. He turned away, pretending to check the water level in the trough, giving himself a moment to compose himself before the emotion could overwhelm him completely. By the end of the first week, Ghost was eating regularly, though he remained cautious around Jake, maintaining a careful distance that spoke of past betrayals and learned wariness. Jake respected that boundary, never pushing, never demanding more than the horse was willing to give. He'd learned long ago that trust couldn't be forced or rushed. It had to be earned through consistency and patience, through showing up day after day regardless of whether progress was being made. The town's judgment continued to find him in unexpected ways. Clara from the feed store made a point of asking how his investment was working out every time he came in to buy supplies he couldn't really afford. The ranch hands at the Double B would go quiet when he approached, then break into barely suppressed laughter once they thought he was out of earshot. Even the veterinarian, Doc Hendricks, who Jake had called out to examine Ghost's leg, delivered his assessment with the kind of gentle pity usually reserved for terminal diagnoses. "The ligament damage is extensive and long-standing," Doc Hendricks had explained, his hands gentle as they probed the stallion's deformed leg. "Combined with the bone malformation, this horse will never be sound. He'll always have pain, always have limited mobility. If you're thinking about breeding him, I'd advise against it. This condition appears to be hereditary." Jake had nodded, absorbing the information that confirmed everything Pete Wilson had told him at the auction. "And if I'm not thinking about breeding or working him, if I just want to give him a comfortable life, is that possible?" Doc Hendricks had looked at him with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. "It's possible, I suppose, with anti-inflammatory medication and careful management. But Jake, that's going to cost money. Ongoing money. Money you don't have." The unspoken question hung between them. Why would you do this? Why would you sentence yourself to years of expense and effort for an animal that will never give you anything back? "Because he deserves it," Jake had replied simply. "Because everything deserves a chance to live without constant pain, to know what it feels like to be valued for existing, rather than for what it can produce." Doc Hendricks had written the prescription and left without further comment. But Jake had seen something in the older man's face that might have been respect or might have been deeper pity. The medication helped. Within days of starting the anti-inflammatory treatment, Ghost began moving with noticeably less discomfort. He still favored the damaged leg, still moved with caution and deliberation, but the constant trembling eased, and he started exploring his corral with something that approached curiosity. He would stand at the fence in the mornings, watching Jake work on repairs to the barn, those strange pink eyes tracking every movement with focused attention. Jake found himself looking forward to those moments of observation, to the silent companionship that was developing between them. He would talk to Ghost while he worked, explaining what he was doing and why, sharing his thoughts about everything from the weather to the state of the world. The horse never responded beyond an occasional flick of his good ear, but Jake sensed he was listening, that the words mattered even if they couldn't be answered. 3 weeks after bringing Ghost home, Jake woke before dawn to the sound of the stallion moving in the corral. He pulled on his boots and walked out into the pre-dawn darkness, his breath misting in the cold air. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. Ghost was actually trotting along the fence line, his movement still uneven but noticeably improved. The damaged leg still couldn't bear full weight, but the horse was moving with purpose and what looked almost like joy. By the second month, Jake had fallen into a rhythm with Ghost that felt almost like a dance, each partner learning the steps and boundaries of the other. Every morning before dawn, he would walk out to the corral with fresh hay and grain, and Ghost would be waiting at the fence, his pale coat almost luminous in the pre-dawn light. The stallion had begun to nicker softly when he heard Jake's footsteps, a sound of greeting that never failed to warm something cold and lonely in Jake's chest. The financial reality of his decision hit harder than Jake had anticipated. The medication Doc Hendricks had prescribed cost nearly $60 a month, a sum that represented more than a week's worth of groceries. Jake found himself making choices he'd never had to make before, skipping meals to ensure Ghost's feed bill was covered, wearing his work shirts until they were more patch than original fabric, letting his truck registration lapse for an extra month because the money simply wasn't there to cover both the tags and the horse's needs. Clara at the feed store had started keeping a running tab for him, something she'd never done in all the years he'd been buying supplies. The gesture was kind, but it came with a price that had nothing to do with money. Every time Jake came in to make a payment, even a partial one, Clara would look at him with eyes that held more pity than respect. She would ask about the horse with the careful tone people use when discussing a mistake they're too polite to openly criticize. "Still keeping that albino, Jake? Must be eating you out of house and home by now." The weight of public opinion pressed down on Jake from all directions. At the diner, where he sometimes splurged on coffee when the loneliness got too heavy, conversations would quiet when he entered. The ranchers who had once treated him as an equal, or at least as a competent hired hand worthy of respect, now seemed to view him as an object of curiosity, like a man who'd suffered some kind of mental break and needed to be handled gently. Tom Rawlings, who owned the largest spread in the county, had actually pulled him aside one morning to offer him a job, steady work with decent pay, if you're having money troubles, Jake. No shame in admitting that horse was a mistake. Jake had declined as politely as his pride would allow, but the encounter had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Because Tom was right, wasn't he? By every practical measure, Ghost was a mistake. The horse would never work, never earn back the money being poured into his care, never be anything more than an expensive reminder of Jake's poor judgment. But something stubborn in Jake's nature refused to reduce the stallion to mere economics, to judge his worth only in terms of utility and return on investment. Ghost himself seemed unaware of the controversy his existence had created. He grew stronger with each passing week, his coat taking on a healthier sheen, his body slowly filling out as regular meals and reduced pain allowed him to thrive. The damaged leg remained a limitation, but Ghost had learned to compensate, to move in ways that minimized strain while still allowing him freedom of movement. He would spend hours exploring his corral, investigating every corner with the focused attention of a creature discovering the world anew. Jake began spending his evenings in the corral with Ghost, sitting on an overturned bucket and reading aloud from books he'd borrowed from the tiny library in town. He wasn't sure why he did it at first. Perhaps it was loneliness, the need to hear his own voice saying something other than practical observations about work and weather. But as the weeks passed, he noticed that Ghost would position himself closer during these reading sessions, his pink eyes half closed in what looked like contentment, his good ear angled toward Jake's voice. They worked through Steinbeck and Cormac McCarthy, through collections of poetry that Jake had never imagined he'd enjoy, through old westerns that felt both familiar and strange when read aloud in the presence of a horse who seemed to actually listen. Sometimes Jake would look up from the page to find Ghost watching him with an intensity that felt almost human in its attention, and he would wonder what the horse made of these stories, whether they meant anything to a creature who lived entirely in the present moment. One evening in late November, Jake was reading from a collection of Mary Oliver poems when Ghost did something unexpected. The stallion approached him directly, something he'd never done before, and lowered his great head until his muzzle rested gently against Jake's shoulder. The gesture was so deliberate, so clearly intentional, that Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. He set the book aside and reached up slowly to stroke Ghost's neck, feeling the warmth of living muscle beneath the pale coat, the steady rhythm of breath and heartbeat that spoke of life persisting against all odds. "You know what they're saying about us in town," Jake said quietly, his hand moving in slow circles along Ghost's neck. "They think I'm crazy, think I'm throwing my life away on a horse that'll never be worth anything. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am crazy. But sitting here with you, feeling you trust me enough to come this close, I can't bring myself to care what they think." The stallion's ear flicked forward, as if acknowledging the words, and Jake felt something loosen in his chest, some knot of anxiety he'd been carrying for so long it had become part of his basic architecture. The weather turned cold in December, and Jake spent his meager savings on materials to winterize the small barn, creating a space where Ghost could escape the worst of the wind and snow. He worked late into the evenings, his hands going numb as he hammered boards and sealed gaps, driven by a determination that felt almost desperate. This horse had trusted him, had chosen to live when everything in his circumstances suggested giving up would be easier. The least Jake could do was provide shelter against the coming winter. Christmas came and went with little fanfare. Jake couldn't afford gifts or holiday meals, but he tied a red ribbon around Ghost's neck on Christmas morning, a gesture that felt both foolish and necessary. The stallion tolerated the decoration with patient dignity before rubbing it off against the fence post. Jake laughed, the sound startling him with its genuine joy, and realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that, without bitterness or irony, just pure amusement at a moment of simple absurdity. January brought snow that transformed Second Chance Ranch into something almost beautiful, softening the harsh edges of poverty with a blanket of pristine white. Jake woke each morning to the sound of Ghost moving in the barn, the familiar rhythm of hooves on wood that had become as comforting as a heartbeat. The stallion had adapted to his shelter with surprising enthusiasm, seeming to understand that the warmth and protection it offered was a gift given freely, with no strings attached. But the winter also brought challenges that stretched Jake's resources to the breaking point. The cost of hay had increased, feed suppliers raising their prices in response to a drought the previous summer that had devastated crops across 3 states. Jake's truck finally gave up entirely, the engine seizing on a bitter morning when the temperature had dropped below zero. He couldn't afford the repairs, so he started walking the 3 miles into town when he needed supplies, carrying what he could on his back and making multiple trips when necessary. The physical toll of his circumstances began to show. Jake lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, his frame growing gaunt in a way that mirrored how Ghost had looked when he'd first brought him home. His clothes hung loose, his face grew more weathered, and the lines around his eyes deepened with the strain of constant worry about money and survival. Pete Wilson stopped by one afternoon, took one look at Jake, and returned an hour later with a basket of food from his wife and a lecture about pride being a poor substitute for common sense. "You're killing yourself over that horse," Pete said bluntly, his breath misting in the cold air as they stood in Jake's small kitchen. "And for what? So you can say you didn't give up? There's no shame in admitting this isn't working, Jake. That animal would be just as dead in a slaughterhouse as you're going to be if you keep starving yourself to feed him." The words hit harder than Pete probably intended, not because they were cruel, but because they contained an uncomfortable grain of truth. Jake was sacrificing everything for Ghost, pouring every dollar and every ounce of energy into keeping the horse alive and comfortable. But what Pete couldn't understand, what none of them could understand, was that Ghost had become more than just a horse. He had become proof that something discarded and broken could still have value, could still deserve care and respect. If Jake gave up on Ghost, he would be admitting that everyone who had ever given up on him had been right to do so. "I appreciate your concern," Jake said quietly, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee Pete had brought. "But I'm not ready to quit on him yet." Pete shook his head slowly, the gesture tired and resigned. "Your choice, Jake. Just don't wait so long that you don't have a choice anymore." After Pete left, Jake stood at his kitchen window watching Ghost in the corral, the stallion's white coat brilliant against the snow, and wondered if stubbornness was really strength or just another form of self-destruction. The turning point came on a morning in late January when Jake woke to find he couldn't get out of bed. His body simply refused to cooperate, muscles weak and trembling, his head spinning when he tried to sit up. He lay there for what might have been minutes or hours, staring at the ceiling of his trailer and listening to Ghost moving in the barn, waiting for breakfast that wasn't coming. The realization that he had pushed himself too far came with a mixture of shame and relief. Shame at his weakness and relief that the decision about what to do next might be taken out of his hands. But then he heard it. Ghost's nicker, the sound the stallion made when calling for him. It was different this time, more insistent, almost demanding. Jake closed his eyes and tried to ignore it, tried to let the exhaustion pull him back down into unconsciousness. But the nickering continued, growing louder, more urgent. And finally, Jake found himself dragging his body out of bed through sheer force of will. He stumbled to the kitchen, made it to the door, and nearly fell down the steps before catching himself on the railing. Ghost was standing at the gate to the barn, his pink eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that seemed to burn through the fog of exhaustion. The stallion pawed at the ground, tossed his head, and nickered again. That sound, filled with what Jake could only interpret as concern, gave him the strength to put one foot in front of the other. He made it to the barn, fed Ghost with hands that shook, and then simply sat down in the hay beside the feed bucket, too tired to make it back to the house. He woke hours later to find Ghost standing over him, the stallion's warm breath on his face, those strange pink eyes watching with an expression that looked almost human in its worry. Jake reached up and touched the horse's muzzle, feeling the soft velvet texture, the warmth of living flesh. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was thanking Ghost for. For needing him, perhaps. For giving him a reason to get up when his body wanted to surrender. Doc Hendricks came by that evening, summoned by Pete Wilson, who had apparently been checking on Jake more frequently than Jake had realized. The doctor examined him with brisk efficiency, asked pointed questions about his eating habits and general health, and delivered a diagnosis that was both expected and devastating. "You're malnourished, Jake. Borderline dangerously so. You need rest, proper food, and probably a good hard look at your priorities." Jake nodded, accepting the lecture because he knew he deserved it. But when Doc Hendricks suggested, as gently as possible, that perhaps it was time to consider finding Ghost a new home, somewhere the horse could be cared for properly while Jake focused on his own health, something fierce and protective rose in Jake's chest. "No," he said, the word coming out with more force than he'd intended. We stay together. We're a package deal." The doctor sighed, packed up his bag, and left some vitamin supplements with instructions to actually take them. As his truck disappeared down the road, Jake walked back out to the barn where Ghost was waiting. The stallion approached without hesitation now, pressing his forehead against Jake's chest in a gesture that had become their form of greeting. Jake wrapped his arms around Ghost's neck, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady proof of life persisting against impossible odds. "We're going to figure this out," Jake promised, speaking as much to himself as to the horse. "I don't know how yet, but we're going to make this work." Ghost's ear flicked forward, and Jake chose to believe it was agreement. The help came from an unexpected source. 3 days after Doc Hendrix's visit, a truck pulled up to Second Chance Ranch, and a woman Jake had never seen before stepped out. She was in her 60s, dressed in practical ranch clothes, her gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense braid. She introduced herself as Margaret Chen, and she said she'd heard about Jake and his albino stallion from Clara at the feed store. Jake braced himself for another lecture about poor judgment and wasted resources, but what came instead caught him completely off guard. "I run a therapeutic riding program about 40 miles from here," Margaret said, her eyes moving past Jake to where Ghost stood watching from the corral. "We work with children who have physical disabilities, trauma survivors, veterans with PTSD. We use horses to help them heal." She paused, her gaze returning to Jake's face. "Clara mentioned your horse has a congenital leg defect, that he'll never be sound enough for regular work. I'd like to see him, if you don't mind." Jake led her to the corral, uncertain what this woman could possibly want with Ghost. The stallion approached the fence with his usual caution, his pink eyes assessing this stranger with careful attention. Margaret stood silent for a long moment, simply observing. Then she did something that surprised Jake. She began speaking softly to Ghost, not in the high-pitched baby talk some people used with animals, but in a calm, respectful tone that acknowledged the horse's intelligence and dignity. Ghost moved closer, his ears forward with interest. Within minutes, the stallion was allowing Margaret to touch his neck, to run her hands along his malformed leg, with gentle expertise. She examined him thoroughly, her movements practiced and sure, and Jake could see she knew horses the way he did, with an understanding that went beyond book learning into the realm of instinct and experience. When she finally turned back to Jake, her expression was thoughtful. "He's remarkable," she said simply. "The pain he must have lived with, the neglect before you got him, and yet there's no meanness in him, no aggression. That's rare in a horse that's suffered as much as he has." Jake felt a surge of protective pride, hearing someone finally recognize what he'd seen in Ghost from the beginning. "That's why I bought him," Jake said. "Everyone else saw a lame horse that needed putting down. I saw something worth saving." Margaret nodded slowly. "I think he could do important work, Jake. Not physical work, obviously, but emotional work. Children who are afraid of their own broken bodies respond to animals who are also broken but still functional. Veterans who feel like they'll never be whole again find hope in horses that have overcome trauma. Your Ghost here," she gestured toward the stallion. "He could help people heal, if you'd be willing to let him." The proposal hit Jake like a physical blow. After months of everyone telling him to get rid of Ghost, to cut his losses and move on, here was someone suggesting the horse had value, had purpose, had something meaningful to contribute to the world. But the proposal also meant sharing Ghost, allowing him to work with strangers, risking his well-being in ways Jake wasn't sure he was prepared for. "What would it involve?" Jake asked cautiously. Margaret explained her program in detail. The horses lived on her ranch, a larger facility with staff and resources Jake could never provide. They received top-quality care, regular veterinary attention, and worked only a few hours a week with carefully supervised clients. The horses weren't ridden, just led and groomed and allowed to be present with people who needed their calm acceptance. Ghost's limitations wouldn't be a problem. In fact, his visible disability made him perfect for the work. "You could visit whenever you wanted," Margaret added, clearly reading the reluctance on Jake's face. "And if it doesn't work out, if Ghost doesn't adapt well to the program, you can take him back immediately. No questions, no judgment. I'm not trying to take your horse away from you, Jake. I'm trying to give both of you something you need." What Jake needed, what he couldn't quite bring himself to say out loud, was relief from the crushing financial burden that was slowly destroying him. Margaret's program would cover all of Ghost's expenses, medical care, feed, supplements, everything. Jake would be freed from the constant anxiety about money, from the choices between his own survival and the horse's care. But accepting the offer felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that everyone who said he couldn't handle this responsibility had been right. He asked for time to think about it, and Margaret agreed graciously, leaving her contact information and an open invitation to visit her facility. After she drove away, Jake walked out to the corral where Ghost was waiting. The stallion pressed his forehead against Jake's chest, their customary greeting, and Jake wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, breathing in the warm scent of hay and horse that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. "I don't want to let you go," Jake said quietly. "Even for something good, even for work that matters. You're the only thing in my life that's ever made sense, the only choice I've made that felt right, even when everyone said it was wrong." Ghost's ear flicked at the sound of his voice, and Jake felt the horse's breath warm against his shirt, steady and alive. But that night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, Jake forced himself to confront an uncomfortable truth. His love for Ghost had become selfish. He was so focused on not giving up, on proving everyone wrong, that he'd lost sight of what was actually best for the horse. Ghost deserved more than a broke cowboy who could barely feed himself. He deserved consistent care, reliable medical attention, a life free from the constant stress of scarcity. The decision, when Jake finally made it, felt like something breaking and healing simultaneously. He called Margaret the next morning and agreed to a trial period. Ghost would go to her ranch for 3 months. If the work suited him, if he seemed happy and healthy, Jake would make the arrangement permanent. If not, Ghost would come home, and Jake would figure something else out. The day they loaded Ghost into Margaret's trailer was one of the hardest of Jake's life. The stallion loaded willingly enough, trusting Jake as he had learned to do over their months together. But when Ghost turned those pink eyes toward Jake through the trailer slats, when he nickered softly, as if asking why Jake wasn't coming too, Jake had to turn away to hide the tears that threatened to overwhelm him. The silence at Second Chance Ranch after Ghost left was deafening. Jake had grown so accustomed to the sounds of the stallion, the soft nickering in the morning, the rhythmic movement in the barn at night, the occasional snort of contentment during their evening reading sessions. Without those sounds, the property felt abandoned, as if the heart had been cut out of it, leaving only an empty shell behind. For the first week, Jake couldn't bring himself to go into the barn. He would stand at the door, his hand on the latch, and then turn away, unable to face the empty stall and the memories it contained. He told himself he'd made the right decision, that Ghost was better off with Margaret's resources and expertise, that sometimes love meant letting go. But the words felt hollow, like something people said to make hard choices seem noble rather than what they really were, which was simply hard. The town's reaction to Ghost's departure was predictable. Relief mixed with vindication, as if Jake had finally come to his senses and done what everyone had been telling him to do from the beginning. Clara at the feed store actually patted his hand sympathetically when he came in to settle his remaining tab. "I know it was hard, Jake, but you did the right thing. That horse needed more than you could give him." The words were meant kindly, but they cut deeper than any mockery had. Only Pete Wilson seemed to understand that Jake's decision hadn't been about admitting defeat. "You gave that horse months he wouldn't have had otherwise," Pete said one evening over coffee at the diner. "You saved his life, gave him a chance to be something other than dog food. That matters, Jake. Don't let anyone tell you it doesn't." Jake appreciated the words, but they didn't fill the ghost-shaped hole that had opened up in his daily existence. Physically, Jake began to recover. With the financial burden of Ghost's care lifted, he could afford to eat properly again. The weight came back slowly, his strength returning, the dangerous edge of malnutrition receding. He picked up odd jobs around town, fixing fences and breaking horses for ranchers who remembered his skill, even if they'd questioned his judgment. The money wasn't much, but it was enough to start rebuilding his depleted savings, to fix his truck, to make long overdue repairs on his property. But emotionally, Jake felt like he was moving through his days in a fog. He would catch himself setting out 2 coffee cups in the morning before remembering he was alone. He would start to share an observation with Ghost before realizing the corral was empty. At night, he still sat in the barn, reading aloud from books, his voice echoing in the empty space, unable to break the habit even though there was no longer anyone to listen. Margaret called every week with updates. Ghost had settled into the program beautifully, she reported. He was working with a little girl who had cerebral palsy, a veteran who'd lost both legs in combat, a teenager recovering from a severe car accident. The clients gravitated to him, drawn to something in his calm acceptance of his own limitations that gave them permission to accept their own. "He's transforming lives, Jake," Margaret said during one call. "Every person who works with him leaves a little more hopeful, a little more willing to believe they can adapt and overcome." Jake listened to these reports with a mixture of pride and grief. He was glad Ghost had found purpose, glad the stallion was helping people in ways Jake never could have facilitated. But knowing Ghost was thriving without him created a pain that wouldn't quite heal. It confirmed what Jake had always suspected about himself, that he wasn't enough, that even the things he loved most were better off without him. 6 weeks after Ghost left, Margaret invited Jake to visit the facility. The drive took him through countryside he'd never explored, rolling hills and prosperous ranches that made his 40 acres of scrubland seem even more meager by comparison. Margaret's property was impressive, well-maintained buildings, spacious paddocks, horses that gleamed with health and careful grooming. Everything about the place spoke of resources and professionalism, of a level of care Jake could never have provided. Ghost was in a large paddock with 3 other horses, all of them special needs animals in various ways. A mare with only one eye, a gelding with severe arthritis, a pony that had been rescued from a hoarding situation. They moved together with easy companionship, and Jake could see immediately that Ghost had found his herd, his place in a community of broken things that had learned to function despite their limitations. When Ghost saw Jake approaching the fence, the stallion's reaction made Jake's throat tighten with emotion. Ghost whinnied, a sound of pure joy, and trotted across the paddock with his uneven gait, moving faster than Jake had ever seen him move. He pushed his head over the fence, pressing his forehead against Jake's chest in their familiar greeting, and Jake felt something that had been frozen inside him begin to thaw. "You're happy here," Jake said, his hands running along Ghost's neck, feeling the improved muscle tone, the healthy weight, the coat that shone with proper nutrition and care. "That's good. That's what I wanted for you." Margaret appeared beside him, her expression understanding. "He asks for you," she said quietly. "Every day around sunset he stands at the gate looking down the road, like he's waiting for you to come. We can tell it's his Jake time because he gets restless, almost anxious. The knowledge that Ghost still remembered him, still wanted him, eased something in Jake's chest. He spent the rest of the afternoon at the facility, watching Ghost work with a young boy who had been burned in a house fire. The child's hands were scarred and stiff, his movements cautious and painful. But as he brushed Ghost's coat, as the stallion stood with infinite patience while the boy worked, Jake saw something shift in the child's expression. A lightness, a moment of forgetting his own suffering in the simple act of caring for another broken creature. The transformation in how people viewed Jake's decision didn't happen overnight. It started with small shifts, barely noticeable at first, like the first green shoots of spring grass pushing through winter-hardened ground. The mother of the burned boy came to find Jake at the diner one morning, her eyes red-rimmed but her expression determined. She introduced herself as Sarah Mitchell and asked if she could sit down. Jake nodded, uncertain what this woman could want from him. "My son hasn't spoken since the fire," Sarah said without preamble. 6 months of silence, of therapists and specialists and medications, and nothing broke through. But yesterday, after working with your horse, he whispered something to me. He said Ghost understands. Just those 2 words, but it was the first time I'd heard his voice in half a year. She reached across the table and gripped Jake's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you for not giving up on that horse. Thank you for seeing something in him that no one else could see." Jake didn't know what to say. He'd never thought about Ghost's impact extending beyond the horse himself, never imagined that his stubborn refusal to abandon a lame stallion could ripple outward to touch other lives in meaningful ways. The woman left, but her words stayed with him, settling into the hollow places that Ghost's absence had created and filling them with something that felt almost like purpose. More stories followed. A veteran named Marcus Williams stopped by Second Chance Ranch one afternoon, his prosthetic legs evident in the mechanical way he navigated Jake's uneven yard. He'd heard Jake lived here, he said, wanted to meet the man who'd saved Ghost. The stallion had been working with Marcus for 4 weeks now, and something about the horse's calm acceptance of his own disability had helped Marcus accept his own losses in a way years of therapy hadn't accomplished. "That horse of yours taught me something," Marcus said, standing beside Jake and looking out over the scrubland that composed Second Chance Ranch. "He taught me that being broken doesn't mean being worthless, that you can lose something fundamental and still have value, still have purpose." I'd forgotten that, lost it somewhere between the explosion and the hospital and the long road home. But Ghost remembered it. Or maybe he never forgot it in the first place. Either way, he gave it back to me. Jake found himself making regular trips to Margaret's facility, ostensibly to check on Ghost, but really to witness the miracle of what the stallion had become. Ghost had developed an almost uncanny ability to sense who needed him most. In a group of clients, he would gravitate toward the one carrying the heaviest burden, the deepest pain. He would stand beside them with patient presence, his pink eyes soft with an understanding that transcended species, offering the kind of acceptance that required nothing in return. A teenage girl who'd attempted suicide worked with Ghost every Thursday. Jake watched her transformation over weeks, from hollow-eyed and withdrawn to gradually more present, more engaged with the world around her. She told Jake one day that Ghost had saved her life, that seeing him move with dignity despite his pain had made her reconsider her own choice to give up. "If he can keep going," she said, her hand resting on Ghost's neck, "then maybe I can too." The local newspaper got wind of the story and sent a reporter to interview Jake. He was reluctant at first, uncomfortable with attention, and unsure how to explain his connection to Ghost in ways that wouldn't sound foolish. But the reporter, a young woman named Amanda Chen, Margaret's granddaughter as it turned out, was persistent and kind. She spent a full day at the facility, talking to clients and staff, photographing Ghost with the people he helped, and listening to Jake talk about the day he'd bought a lame albino stallion while everyone laughed. The article ran on the front page of the Sunday edition, complete with a full-color photo of Ghost standing beside Marcus Williams, the veteran's hand resting on the stallion's neck, both of them looking at the camera with expressions of quiet dignity. The headline read, "From Auction Joke to Healing Hope, The Albino Stallion Teaching a Town About Value. Jake read it 3 times, each time feeling something shift inside him, like pieces of himself he'd thought were permanently broken, clicking back into place. The response was overwhelming. Margaret's facility received calls from other therapeutic programs wanting to know about Ghost, from researchers studying animal-assisted therapy, from news outlets wanting to do follow-up stories. But more importantly for Jake, the response from his own community began to change. People who had mocked his purchase now stopped him on the street to tell him they'd read the article, that they'd been wrong about Ghost, that what Jake had done was actually pretty remarkable. Clara at the feed store apologized, an actual genuine apology that came with tears in her eyes and an admission that she'd been so focused on the practical side of things that she'd missed the point entirely. Tom Rawlings, the big rancher who'd offered Jake a pity job months ago, showed up at Second Chance Ranch with a proposal. His own daughter was struggling with depression, and he wanted to know if Jake could arrange for her to work with Ghost. The humility in his request, the acknowledgement that Jake possessed something valuable after all, meant more than Jake knew how to express. But the most significant change was internal. Jake had spent his entire adult life feeling like he was chasing something just out of reach, some validation or success that would prove his worth. He'd measured himself against other men's ranches, other men's accomplishments, and always found himself coming up short. But Ghost had taught him a different way of measuring value, not by what you could produce or achieve, but by the simple fact of persisting with dignity, of choosing life and growth even when everything suggested giving up would be easier. 6 months after that auction where everyone had laughed, Jake stood at Margaret's facility watching Ghost work with a small child who had muscular dystrophy. The boy's mother stood beside Jake, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son smile for the first time in weeks. "This is a miracle," she whispered. "Your horse is a miracle." Jake shook his head gently, his eyes on Ghost's pale form as the stallion stood with infinite patience while the boy's weak hands struggled to hold the brush. By the time 6 months had passed since that auction, Jake's life had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. The speaking requests started coming in, small at first: a talk at the local Rotary Club, a presentation at the community college about animal-assisted therapy, and second chances. Jake was uncomfortable with public speaking. His hands would shake and his voice would go rough, but he did it anyway because the story wasn't really about him. It was about Ghost, and about the truth that worth wasn't determined by perfection or productivity, but by something deeper and more essential. The speaking fees, modest though they were, added up. Combined with the steady work he'd been getting from ranchers who now saw him as the man who'd recognized value where no one else had, Jake found himself with actual savings for the first time in his adult life. He paid off his debts, fixed up Second Chance Ranch properly, even bought 3 rescue horses that were too old or too damaged for regular work, but could live out their days in peace on his 40 acres. The property began to look less like an expression of poverty and more like a statement of purpose. But money wasn't the most significant change. Jake himself felt different, like something fundamental had shifted in how he moved through the world. The shame that had followed him for decades, that constant sense of not being enough, had loosened its grip. He'd spent his whole life believing the voices that told him he was foolish, impractical, destined to fail. Ghost had taught him that those voices were wrong, that sometimes the foolish choice was the brave choice, and that failure was often just success that hadn't been properly understood yet. Margaret approached him one evening in late June as he was finishing a visit with Ghost. She had a proposal, she said, and from the careful way she presented it, Jake could tell she expected resistance. The program had grown beyond what she'd anticipated, the demand for Ghost's particular kind of healing far exceeding their capacity. She wanted to establish a formal partnership with Jake to create a training program that could teach other people how to work with damaged animals in therapeutic settings. Jake would run the program, using Second Chance Ranch as a satellite facility. The offer represented everything Jake had ever wanted: security, purpose, recognition of his skills and insights. But accepting it meant acknowledging that his relationship with Ghost had evolved into something bigger than their personal connection, that the stallion belonged not just to Jake, but to everyone whose life he touched. It meant sharing Ghost even more than he already had, giving up the fantasy that someday the horse might come back to live permanently at Second Chance Ranch. Jake took a week to consider the proposal, spending long hours sitting in Ghost's paddock, the stallion's head resting against his shoulder while they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Ghost was 14 years old now, getting on in years for a horse, especially one with his health challenges. The reality that their time together was finite had become more pressing, more immediate. Jake wanted to hoard every moment, to keep Ghost close and preserve the bond they'd built. But he also understood that love sometimes meant enabling something bigger than your own needs. He accepted Margaret's offer on a warm evening in July, standing in the facility's office while Ghost grazed peacefully in the paddock outside the window. The partnership would begin in the fall, giving Jake time to prepare his property and develop curriculum for training other handlers. Margaret's eyes were bright with satisfaction, but also with understanding of what this cost him. "You're doing the right thing," she said quietly. "Ghost's legacy will extend far beyond his own life. Because of him, countless other animals will get second chances they wouldn't have had otherwise." The concept of legacy had never occurred to Jake before. He'd been too focused on simple survival to think about what he might leave behind, what meaning his life might have beyond the day-to-day struggle of existence. But Ghost had given him that, a purpose that transcended his own mortality, a story that would continue to matter long after both of them were gone. The broken cowboy and the lame stallion, two cast-offs who'd found each other and discovered that brokenness didn't mean worthlessness, that the things the world discarded often held the most precious truths. As summer deepened, Jake split his time between Second Chance Ranch and Margaret's facility. He began documenting Ghost's methods, if they could be called methods, trying to articulate what the stallion did that made him so effective as a therapy animal. But the more Jake observed, the more he realized that Ghost's gift couldn't be fully taught or replicated. It was something intrinsic to who he was, a kind of emotional intelligence that allowed him to sense exactly what each person needed and offer it without judgment or expectation. What could be taught, Jake discovered, was how to recognize that quality in other animals, how to see past the obvious damage to the potential that lived within it, how to create environments where broken creatures, both human and animal, could heal together. These insights formed the foundation of the training program Jake developed, and they drew directly from his own experience of being written off and then discovering he'd had value all along. One afternoon in late August, Jake received a call that changed everything. The caller was a producer from a national morning show. They'd seen the newspaper article and the follow-up stories, and they wanted to feature Ghost on their program. It would mean traveling to New York, bringing Ghost to a television studio, exposing him to crowds and noise and chaos that could potentially undo months of careful work. Jake's instinct was to refuse, to protect Ghost from exploitation, to keep him safe in the quiet world they'd built together. But Margaret pointed out something Jake hadn't considered. The story would reach millions of people. Parents of disabled children, veterans struggling with PTSD, anyone who'd ever felt broken beyond repair. Ghost's message, that damaged things could still have profound purpose, could spread far beyond their small corner of Wyoming. The potential impact was enormous, worth the risk if Ghost could handle it. Jake spent a sleepless night wrestling with the decision, watching Ghost through his window, the stallion's pale coat luminous in the moonlight. Jake said yes to the television appearance, not because he wanted the attention, but because Ghost had taught him that sometimes the hardest choices were the most important ones. They flew to New York on a crisp September morning, Ghost traveling in a specially designed transport that Margaret had arranged. The stallion handled the journey with the same calm dignity he brought to everything, those pink eyes taking in the chaos of airports and cities with curiosity rather than fear. The morning show segment was scheduled for 7 minutes, an eternity in television time apparently, and the producer had warned them it would be emotional. They'd invited several of Ghost's clients to appear, including Marcus Williams, Sarah Mitchell and her son, and the teenage girl who credited Ghost with saving her life. Jake spent the night before the taping unable to sleep, worried about how Ghost would handle the studio lights and cameras, whether the noise and confusion would overwhelm him. But Ghost walked onto that soundstage like he'd been born for it. The studio audience gasped when they saw him, his albino coat nearly glowing under the professional lighting, his uneven gait visible but somehow graceful in its deliberateness. Jake stood beside him, one hand resting on the stallion's neck, feeling the steady warmth of him, the solid proof that broken things could be beautiful. The host, a woman named Rebecca Chen, another member of Margaret's extended family, Jake realized, asked him to tell the story from the beginning. So Jake talked about the auction, about the laughter that had followed his $50 bid, about the moment he'd seen something in Ghost's eyes that everyone else had missed. He talked about nearly starving himself to keep the horse fed, about the morning he'd collapsed and Ghost had called him back to life, about the choice to let Ghost go to Margaret's program even though it felt like cutting out his own heart. Then the clients spoke, each one sharing how Ghost had changed their lives in ways that medicine and therapy hadn't been able to reach. Marcus Williams demonstrated his prosthetic legs, explained how Ghost's acceptance of his own disability had given Marcus permission to accept his losses. Sarah Mitchell's son, his scarred hands visible to the cameras, spoke haltingly about how Ghost understood pain in a way that humans couldn't quite grasp, how the stallion had given him back his voice by showing him that survival itself was a form of courage. The teenage girl, whose name was Emma and who was now 17 and planning to study veterinary medicine, told the audience that Ghost had taught her the difference between being broken and being finished. "I thought I was finished," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "But Ghost showed me that broken things can still grow, can still matter, can still make the world better just by refusing to give up." Rebecca turned to Jake for his final thoughts, and he found himself struggling to articulate something he'd been feeling for months, but had never quite put into words. "6 months ago," Jake said slowly, "I was the joke of my town. A broke cowboy who spent his last $50 on a lame horse everyone said should be put down. People laughed at me, pitied me, told me I was throwing my life away." He paused, his hand moving along Ghost's neck. "They were wrong, not about the horse being lame or about me being broke. They were wrong about what those things meant." He looked directly at the camera, thinking about all the people watching who might be struggling with their own version of brokenness, their own sense of being discarded and worthless. We live in a world that measures value by productivity, by perfection, by how much profit something can generate. But Ghost taught me that real value is something different entirely. It's about dignity in the face of pain. It's about choosing life even when everything suggests giving up would be easier. It's about recognizing that the things we think are damaged beyond repair are often the things with the most to teach us. The segment ended with footage of Ghost working with various clients, his pale form moving through the frames with patient grace, and Jake could see the impact in Rebecca's expression, in the faces of the crew, in the absolute silence of the studio audience. This wasn't just a feel-good story about a rescue horse. This was something deeper, a challenge to fundamental assumptions about worth and value and what made life meaningful. The response to the broadcast was overwhelming. Margaret's facility received thousands of calls and emails from people wanting to work with Ghost, to start similar programs in their own communities, to share their own stories of overcoming damage and discovering purpose. The therapeutic riding movement, which had been growing steadily for years, suddenly exploded into mainstream awareness. Ghost became the face of a national conversation about disability, resilience, and the healing power of connection across species. Jake returned to Wyoming with Ghost 2 days later, both of them exhausted but somehow lighter, as if they'd discharged a responsibility they'd been carrying without fully understanding its weight. The town that had laughed at Jake's purchase 6 months earlier now greeted them with a banner stretched across Main Street that read, "Welcome home, Ghost and Jake, our heroes." The irony wasn't lost on Jake, but neither was the genuine warmth behind the gesture. Clara from the feed store organized a community celebration at Second Chance Ranch, bringing food and decorations and inviting everyone who'd witnessed the auction that had started everything. Pete Wilson gave a toast, his voice thick with emotion as he admitted he'd been wrong to doubt Jake's choice. Tom Rawlings announced he was donating funding for Jake's training program, wanting to support work that had helped his daughter find hope again. But the moment Jake treasured most came that evening, after everyone had left and the celebration had faded into memory. He sat in Ghost's paddock, the stallion's head resting against his shoulder, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. They'd come so far from that dusty auction yard, from the laughter and the certainty of his failure. They'd proven something that needed proving, that value existed independent of utility, that brokenness was not the same as worthlessness, that sometimes the most important choice was the one everyone said was foolish. Ghost nickered softly, that familiar sound of contentment, and Jake wrapped his arms around the stallion's neck, breathing in the warm scent that had become home. "Thank you," Jake whispered, "for teaching me that second chances aren't just about being rescued. They're about learning to see yourself through the eyes of someone who believes you're worth saving." In the distance, the lights of town flickered like earthbound stars, and Jake thought about all the people who were still waiting for their own second chances, still believing the voices that told them they were damaged beyond repair. Because of Ghost, some of them might learn what Jake had learned, that the world's assessment of your worth had nothing to do with your actual value, and that sometimes the best thing you could do with your last $50 was bet it all on something everyone else had given up on. 6 months ago, they'd laughed when the broke Cowboy chose the lame Albino stallion. Now nobody was laughing. They were learning instead, and that made all the difference.